In this video, we'll discuss the features on Alex Honnold's face that point to his capacity for risk-taking, his robust need for natural environments, and his instinctual dialogue with activities that could bring death. Enjoy. Welcome back, everybody. Today we've got Alex Honnold for our face reading. Alex Honnold, if you don't know who he is, I would look him up, go online. He has a documentary called Free Solo. He is world-renowned for climbing some very, very precarious places in terms of rock climbing without any kind of harnesses, no apparatuses. If you watch Free Solo, the documentary, if you have a reasonable constitution and any basic fear for your life, it's terrifying. It made me uneasy watching it, made my hands a little sweaty, and that's pretty common in seeing what he does. The guy's insane. And so we're going to talk about his personality, his aptitudes, his strength, how he's able to do this, and then in relation to his facial features. So if you're new to the channel, welcome. Please go watch the 5-minute crash course face reading video up here. That's going to give you a nice overview, some terms and terminology to consider. And if you're finding value in my content, be sure to like, subscribe, and hit that bell notification. Leave some comments and share this with someone who you think will find it interesting. So he's got a lot going on in his face, and I'm going to start with the big dominant features. We're going to talk about mountains and rivers, and we're also going to talk about the water element, risk-taking. There's some pretty interesting things about his face that link up directly with face reading theory. So first and foremost, there's a couple different lenses and ways to look at the face. One of those is looking at the 5 elements, and when we look at the 5 elements, we're going to be looking at organ function. And so for this conversation, the water element. The water element relates to the kidney and bladder system. Now, typically, when we're talking about the water element showing up on the face, where we're looking for the water element is the forehead, so the size of the forehead, how expansive the forehead is, the ears, under the eyes right here, and then the chin. And so the thinking is when we look at the water element, if those areas of the face are dominant or have coloring that is out of place, or maybe that's just dominant or prominent visually, we're going to see a preponderance of that element being strong in the person. So that's one. He has these things. He's got some big ears. He's got a nice big chin right here. He doesn't have any dark circles under the eyes. That's where we usually see dysfunction in the water element. And he's got a reasonably broad forehead. However, when we look at mountains and rivers, that's another lens in face reading. The rivers are the areas of the face that contain moisture. Now, specifically, usually when we're talking about mountains and rivers, what we're talking about is geography, where people should live, or geographies that people need to interact with to be the most optimized version of themselves. And so this is where the crossover between face reading and feng shui happens. Feng shui classically was about looking at a person's face in relation to the geographical terrain that would be optimal for them. So what's interesting about him, these areas of moisture on the face, are the ears because of earwax. Earwax is seen as a type of moisture. The eyes have moisture, they're wet. The nostrils, the size of them, because of the mucosal lining, is an area of moisture. And then the mouth, because the mouth is moist and has moisture and is wet. So when you think about these areas, these wet areas of the face, the larger and more dominant these are, the more a person is going to, for one, in theory, need to see large bodies of water, or need to be around water or live near water. But what's interesting about Alex Honnold, I'm not sure where he lives, but we want to think rivers, okay, mountains and rivers. The mountains, just for context, are the bony protrusions, the forehead, the cheekbones, the jaw, the nose. These areas, the bony protrusions that stick out of the face, the more dominant those are, the more elevation a person needs, the more interfacing they need with high terrain. They need mountains and whatnot. So he has big mountains and rivers, and I find it really interesting that a guy like this, his life path is about climbing mountains, and when you get up to high mountains, what you see are often large bodies of water, great lakes and things like this. So he's got a face that kind of screams big geography, and he's a climber, and that's fascinating. That's really interesting to me, and I would say in terms of life path, a person lining up with what they're supposed to be doing, according to face reading theory, he's on point. He's doing these things. So now this is where it gets interesting. When we talk about the water element and we talk about rivers on the face, we have to look at the element and what it regulates. The water element on the positive side is going to regulate awe and wonderment. It's about tuning into rhythms larger than ourselves and having awe about them. So people can find this through the study of religion or God. People can study this, or find this through the study of quantum physics, general relativity, things that talk about the universe, right? These large things that are above us and bigger than us. That's all water energy, and our capacity to dialogue with that also relates to the water element. Now, on the other side, the dark side of the water element is fear and terror and being afraid. And that's the part of the water element that digests the negative part of our emotions. So we always have a positive and negative with the elements. What's interesting about him, and one of the things in face reading that they say is when a person has very large ears, the larger the ears, the more capacity they have for risk taking. And it doesn't always have to be physical. It can be being risky with finances. It can be risky with interpersonal dynamics. It can be risky sexually. It can be risk taking in a lot of different capacities. But large ears means the person is wired to a certain degree to handle the fear that comes with risk. So you want to think, big ears on a guy like this, they're very dominant on him. Big risk taking. Now you can see this if you want to kind of dive into this a bit more. Look at UFC fighters, look at wrestlers. Some of the most prominent fighters in the world have big dominant ears. You'll see these guys with the ears that kind of stick out, what I call the monkey ears, the guys that get the cauliflower ear from wrestling around and whatnot. But a lot of fighters have big dominant ears because they are willing to take some risks. Now, exceptions to the rule, yes, there's always going to be some, so don't think of this as an absolute statement for everybody. Features like this are going to be balanced out by other features on the face, but he's got some sizable risk-taking ears, and he takes some pretty sizable risks. Now, what's also interesting about this, these big water features, right? Big eyes, big mouth, big water. You want to think big water element. That means the capacity to regulate and digest fear. So in his case, if you have big ears and big water features, big rivers and stuff, that doesn't mean that you're always going to be excellent at taking risks the way he does. But you have to look at the features in relation to how a person is living. That's where the rubber meets the road. That's where the magic happens. And that's the congruency you're trying to always find and establish is, here's what the features in the book say and what I'm seeing on a person's face, and what the hell are they doing with their life force? And is it their life force, and is it going well? And for him, it is. He's built for this. So he's also got a very lean face, lean constitutionally. You can see it. And this is aligned with the wood element. So he's got a cut jaw, but he doesn't have a particularly square jaw, and his face kind of tapers down. Interestingly, his face tapers down to a point at the top, and his top of his head kind of comes to a point this way. There's almost this kind of implied, I forget what shape that is, if it's trapezoid, but it's narrow at the bottom and then kind of narrower at the top. And from profile, his face looks relatively, I would say, normal in relation to how he presents from the front. When he comes to the front, he's narrow at the top, narrow at the bottom, and a lot of his photos almost have this feeling of a fish nose or a fish lens effect, where it feels like it's kind of up, the camera is up and frontal in his face, but a lot of times it's not. It's just how the energy of his face comes off, and it's almost as if the entirety of his face kind of comes to a point this way, almost like everything kind of draws to a point like this. And that is the energy of the mountain. When a person's face kind of comes to a point, and again, we see this parallel in his face. There's kind of a mountain-like energy to his face. It's lean, it's sharp, there's lots of big bony mountains on it, and it's directly relational to what he's doing with his life. So again, I find that interesting. Now, the wood element is prominent in this, in him, because this leanness, the leanness and the sinewiness is very much a wood trait. So when you see people with lean constitutions, you can see their tendons and ligaments. That's all wood energy, and the wood element regulates our connective tissue. So if you're going to climb and you're using your fingers, these guys in particular, him in particular, is holding on to these rock faces with just his fingertips. What we would use to touch our smartphones with, homeboy is holding on to mountains with. This means strong ligamental connection. Now, if you look at his hands, this kind of deviates from face reading a little bit and kind of goes more into physiognomy, which is the study of the body also, but he's got thick, meaty fingers. So this is an earth element trait. And usually when we see, thin fingers, that's a bit more metallic, it's more about refinement. My hands run a bit more like that. My fingers are not particularly thick, but I come from an art background, fine motor skills. Him, much beefier, much meatier. And that's really interesting because his body is a lot of wood, but his hands read earth. And the earth is about strength of the four limbs, the strength in the legs and the arms, all of which he has. So his hands scream earth and his body is strong. His ligaments are strong. All these things are showing up on his face. Interestingly, what's also kind of fascinating about him is this death mask. And the death mask is this countenance of the face where the face has a slightly skeletal presentation. So we'll see this where we get a cut in the jaw here. We'll see the boniness of the cheeks kind of being prominent, a hollowing of the cheeks here. He has this, but it's a healthy version of it. And the death mask is all about people who have a strong death instinct. The membrane between life and death is pretty thin. Life is pretty fragile. And the people that are able to take those risks and to be on that membrane, dancing with that veil between life and death, it's said that they have the death mask. Death mask isn't necessarily a good thing or a bad thing. It's how a person is wielding their life force. Now, if he was a high drug user and he had this death mask, I'd be like, oh, that's not so great. I understand that what he's doing is very, very high risk, but his face says in face reading speak, in face reading theory, he's literally built and designed to do this kind of thing. Now, what's also interesting about him is when you read about his brain, when they did the scan of his brain, the amygdala is the part of the brain that regulates our response to things that should scare us, our fear response, how terrified we should be when we stand at the edge of a cliff. His amygdala doesn't seem to be firing much at all. And there was one article that was talking about how basically what they were saying is that he requires about 300% more stimuli in terms of fear response than the average person. So what would typically scare anybody, he has a threshold of about 300% higher than that. And that makes a certain amount of sense given what he does. So I found this one little blurb in this article, and it says, Honnold also scores as exceedingly conscientious, associated with the ability to concentrate, remain focused on a task, and see things through. He also surveyed high in premeditation, his typical modus operandi, and very low in neuroticism. And neuroticism, for those of you who don't know, is high negative emotion, fear, worry, concern, doubt, apprehension. That's all neuroticism, making him unlikely to ruminate over unlikely outcomes or risks that are impossible to manage. Quote, if you don't have any fear to begin with, Honnold says, there's a lot less to control. Fascinating. And what that points to is that he has this capacity to digest fear way higher than the average person. So the other thing to kind of think about here, if you want to really spin this out and really have your head spin, is that in Chinese medical theory, the water element regulates something called the sea of marrow. The sea of marrow is your brain, and it's the bone marrow. And it's also, the sea of marrow is like, it's the brain itself. But inside the bones, all the bones of the body is regulated as deep water. It's seen as the deep water energetic. So even at the deepest part of his brain, at the deepest part of the water element, there seems to be this little mechanism that is not firing particularly well. Now, you could argue like, oh, that's a dysfunction. And I would argue, or some people are built to do certain things. Some people are quite literally, they come into existence, according to the Eastern theory, to fulfill a role in humanity. And we all have that, big and small, in some capacity. And that's what face reading helps us do. But I find this very interesting in the context of him. So outside of all of that, his public persona, his natural face, and his inner persona. His public face, his natural face, and the inner persona all pretty much look the same. Now, on his public persona, he has some shadowing, and that shadowing definitely makes his face look a little bit different. But for the most part, these three look like triplets. They look like, they're very closely related if they were all brothers. And that, I always say, is a very good thing because you want congruency between the internal terrain of a person and what they present to the outside world. This is seen as auspicious or lucky because it means what you see is what you get. And it also points to that he is not faking this. He's not just burying his fear or all of these traits that he carries. He really is who he is. This guy really does have some sizable cojones and is willing to climb these rock faces because of what you could call a dysfunction in the brain maybe, or just a superpower of sorts. But even down to the water element itself, he's got this. So I like seeing that there's some congruency between all of these faces. Now, the last little bit is, again, face reading is about lifestyle guidance. It's about looking at a person's face and then saying, hey, you need to lean into these things given how you're running. And so if Alex Honnold was my lifestyle client, I would be saying, hey, given these very strong wood features, these sinewy things I'm seeing, these sizable water features, I would be asking him, do you take reasonable risks? I think these are beyond reasonable risks, for the record, but are you taking risks because you're built for that to a certain degree? Are you working out vigorously because you've got a lot of wood energy, and people with a lot of wood are going to need to be very physically active? Everyone, again, needs to exercise. That's a non-negotiable, I think, personally, for human beings. But some people are going to allocate more energy into that because their bodies naturally have more of an aptitude for it. And that's the thing to remember. So I would be pushing him to very hard exercise, very vigorous exercise. I would be pushing him towards risky endeavors, whether that's financial or something like a stockbroker where there's some risk in the job profile. I would be asking him these kinds of things, and then also asking him, are you getting outside into nature? Because you have some big mountains and rivers, which means nature, the natural world, really does need to be a part of your lifestyle. Because with all of these features, I would say, you being indoors on a computer, selling insurance probably is not the thing for you, given all of these really big nature landmarks, these natural landforms, quote unquote, that show up on your face. So I like when I see that a person like this is doing what they're doing, because it lines up with face reading theory that for a man with a lot of mountains and rivers, he's getting to interface with a lot of mountains and probably seeing a lot of rivers and spending a lot of time in the natural world, which is conducive to his life path and is probably going to help him live a very long time, hopefully, in that, barring any kind of accident. But he does take some pretty sizable risks. So that's my read on Alex Honnold. If you have questions, comments, please leave them below. And as always, please let me know if there's someone else you'd like me to read. Thanks a bunch.